Ash is a member of faculty at Loughborough University in England, and most recently took up an appointment with ourselves here, 3-year appointment as an adjunct senior lecturer. So our reasoning and rationale for inviting Ash to take that position was very much the technology side that we have as a faculty. We are conscious that it's something we need to address and start to talk about and to practice. So we're looking for some guidance from Ash over the 3 years, and I think this is a really nice starting point for that. People can tend to be interactive. Are you happy to take questions as we go along?
Yeah, definitely, yeah.
Yeah, okay. So we'll make it interactive if possible as we go through, and we have to about 5 o'clock until we sort of finish up. Okay, so you're very welcome, Ash.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I will tend to go fairly quickly through slides because that's how I kind of do this. So you need to stop me at a point, it's fine. Just shout at me. Okay, so I'd like to thank Loughborough for allowing me to be here in Limerick, for appointing me and inviting me, and PE Page for inviting me over to do this lecture. So, we'll start with the outline of today's talk, and this is a bit of a storyboard. So, I'm going to start by setting the scene and kind of exploring where I think we are in terms of how technology is being used in physical education at the moment. And then I'm going to look at the reality that exists between where we are and where we could potentially be. And then I'm going to use an illustration to kind of show a little bit of how this process can be exaggerated and shown through a very famous example. And I'm taking some liberties with that, so please don't hold me to account that I've got this historically exactly right, but I'm using it as an illustration. And then I'm going to look at this gap again in terms of, particularly pedagogically, the difference between technology as something that we use and technology that we use pedagogically, and how it is a driver for change. And particularly I'm interested in bridging that gap by looking at this pedagogy of technology idea. And then I'm going to conclude by looking at a future and how we can take that process forwards. So I'll start with setting the scene. So we'll look at physical education specifically. Although discipline-specific technology has been developed generally, technological inclusion has not become commonplace in physical education. And I use the term inclusion very deliberately in terms of the way that it's used, and not integration, which is a different process. Ofsted, in a recent report in the UK, suggested that the best ICT practice in physical education was to be found in the use of interactive whiteboards, still images, digital cameras and video analysis. And Helena Bett suggested that the majority of tools currently used are those related to traditional computer technologies such as Word, Excel, PowerPoint. I found in a study in Australia with a teacher there that the commonest use of ICT was to monitor, assess, record and report on pupils. And exploring the work of Neil Selwyn, he suggests that we are faced with a prevailing sense that the use of technology in education is something that does not merit particular critical scrutiny or thought. Indeed, he suggested that a computer in a classroom is now much a part of the furniture as domestic appliances in a kitchen, or traffic lights, ATMs and security cameras on a high street. Educational technology, Selwyn suggests, is a topic that is often talked about, but less often thought about. Now, Michael Fullen in his work Stratosphere, which looks at technology, pedagogy and change, suggests that technology is well available, but the pedagogical innovation or effective use of ICT is still very rare. But hang on a second. Ken Robinson suggests that new technologies are now transforming how we think, work, play and relate to each other. And Fulham would argue this is occurring in virtually every sector in society that you can think of, except education. And it's the place of furniture, the place of technologies for furniture that forms the heart of this presentation. So this is the reality into what we are using, i.e. ICT, in terms of traditional forms and where it seems to occur. So the reality is that education seems so far behind and is badly disconnected from the outside world. Almost 10 years ago, Richard Riley was once the Education Secretary for Bill Clinton, I believe, suggested that we live at a time when we are preparing students for jobs that don't yet exist, using technologies that haven't yet been invented in order to solve problems we haven't yet identified as problems. And the truth is that children need to be much more than products of an industrial system of education that defines academic ability as passing examinations and gaining diplomas. We need to harness the astounding and abounding creativity and ubiquity of technology in the world at large. But how far behind is education? When the US Department of Commerce ranked 55 non-farm businesses on their IT intensiveness, education ranked 55th, behind coal mining. But why? Fulham recently suggested that the digital lives of students is largely outside of schools and is a fairly undisciplined world. So the question is education being prepared to use technology, or is it part of the furniture? So now I turn to my illustration, my example. I want you to take yourself back. It's the age of Antarctic exploration, and in late 1911, two teams enter the latter stages of their 1,766-mile race to conquer the South Pole. Two men lead the race across the Antarctic wilderness. You have Amundsen from Norway and Scott from Great Britain. So how far is 1,766 miles? So if we use an example, it's the distance from Cork through Limerick to Donegal, taking the wild and Atlantic Way. Did anyone know that existed? Now, this is supposed to be the longest side coastal road in the world at 2,750 kilometres, which is approximately 1,700 miles. And in a very rough calculations, it looks something like that. So it goes, it travels, the Wild Atlantic Way travels the entire west coast. Now, I'm going to try it. So we've got Kerry, Clare, Galloway, Mayo, Sligo, Sligo, Leitrim, and Donegal. So that's where you're travelling. That's where they had to travel in terms of this route. Now, both the teams made it halfway, i.e. to the pole. Scott, on the 17th of January 1912, arrived 35 days after his arrival. At the same time, Amundsen was only a week away from his winter quarters, and his men were in excellent order, without sickness or injuries. Sadly, only one team made it home. Scott's attempt ended in tragedy 20 miles from the winter base. I'd argue that the race and ultimately their lives rested on their use of technology. And in this example, one specific technology, and in this case, Greenland Inuit dogs. Now, I'm defining this as new technology 100 odd years ago, in as much as it hadn't really been used before in polar exploration. And I think it's important to note that if we have the existing technology that we might bring into education, it might not be a new technology, but it's new in that situation. And I think that in terms of how I'm defining these dogs, they weren't new because the Inuits had used them for years, hundreds of years. But in terms of Antarctic exploration, they were a new technology. Now, Amundsen did anything and everything he could to succeed, which included imbuing his whole approach with technology. And he and his team made every decision with that technology in mind. They based everything around their use of dogs and other native tactics, but the dogs are the technology here. In fact, as Ralph Fiennes suggested, they ensured that the dog's efforts saved the energy of his team and kept them in the best of health. Scott eschewed technology for the bulk of his trip. He had used Inuit dogs before in a famous trip in 1909 with Shackleton, and they'd had very near fatal consequences, and decided once bitten, twice shy. So he actively avoided them. Now, Scott consequently chose to rely on the efforts of his team to power them to the pole. So while Amundsen was using technology, in this case, literally as a driver, Amundsen was, Scott was using it as a very, he was using it very much to get somewhere, so he used it for a purpose. And a pedagogy analogy would be that he used it in a tradition, in forms of a traditional lesson. So if we go back to the technologies that are being used, then he would use it like a Word document, or he used it. It was a means to get somewhere, not necessarily to do something with. Now Scott did use some technologies. He used Antarctic ponies, he did use dogs, and you could say he used cutting edge technology in that he used 3 motorised sledges. But he only used them to get into the start line. Now the 3 motorised sledges instead could be described as the cutting edge technology of their day. But while they had the wow factor, and Scott spent nearly 7 times the amount of money on his sledges than he did on the rest of his animals, they broke on the first day. And because he decided not to bring the only member of his team who could repair them with him on the actual expedition, they were useless. So it's the equivalent of using the travelator at the airport. It's expensive to buy and run. It might save you some time and energy, and if it breaks down, well, you can still walk. And that was his aim, get himself to the start line. When they broke down, he just used other places to get him to there. But his sole purpose was to get there through traditional means. It's not a new way of travelling per se. So the dogs were new and innovative in that polar exploration sort of way, but walking wasn't. And these weren't used in that way. They were kind of a way of getting to the departure gate, but not actually committing to the journey itself. And I kind of put it down as being a bit of a teaching gimmick. It's not what I would describe as a pedagogy of technology. And if we take that, the pedagogical equivalent, it would be Wi-Fi is not working, so we can't use this app, so let's just get on with the lesson. Now sometimes that happens anyway, no matter how innovative you are, and you have to do that process. But in this case, it wasn't tied into what was happening. On reaching the start line, Scott failed to make anything except tried and tested with wisdom part of his final attempt. And in fact, when Amundsen was using furs from the Inuits, Scott was still wearing wool and cotton, because that's wool particularly, which wasn't a very good breeze. So what do we learn as a consequence of this? I'm going to pick out 3 examples, and I think you can maybe draw more, but these are the ones that I picked out. The first is that alternatives should be used to do things better, but with due respect, as demonstrated by Amundsen's investment in the use of native tactics. Using technology needs a clear purpose and to be used appropriately, as Amundsen had when he used dogs with careful consideration, but unlike Scott's gesture to the future with his use of sledges. Now, had he invested more time and energy, and he'd actually got the right person with him, and he could work through those problems, they may have turned out to be useful, but still only to get him to a very specific point. Technology needs to be used for the betterment of everyone, i.e. by bringing everyone home in excellent order without sickness or injuries. They're not gimmicks, they're not ways of using it. Hopefully it's ways of looking at what we were discussing yesterday, which is technology-enhanced pedagogy. So we'll move to the gap. I'm conscious of we said this might be interactive, and we haven't actually interacted. Now, either I've bored you or blown you away. So, is this a point to begin a conversation, or should we just keep going?
Keep going.
Bored. Okay. Right. Okay. So Mark Twain said, "I have never let my schooling interfere with my education." Could the same be said about technology? I have never let technology interfere with my teaching. If technology is so much a part of the furniture in schools, why do we need to consider a pedagogy of technology? I would argue that we are presenting technology as unproblematic. It's something as simple as a chair or a computer in that regard. And we scientise it. When we scientise technology, it becomes about technical competence. It becomes about how to use this, rather than how to produce these and use them in the pedagogical process. That's it. For example, a study by Lounsbury and Coker, when they were suggesting video analysis as a way forward, suggested that numerous studies have constantly shown that those individuals receiving systematic specialised training in skills analysis are significantly more accurate in skill diagnosis than those not receiving such training. If we go back to that example, students need to learn about the technology, but they also need to learn about the outcomes and what they do as a consequence. Now, if we go back to video analysis, they need to understand what they're filming, where they stand, what they do, how they play it back, how they give detailed feedback. It's not just a process of, here's an iPad with a camera, off you go. There's much more process in terms of how they lend to that pedagogical process. So I'd argue we need new solutions, and this is where we start to look at this gap between where we are and what we have available to us and what we aspire to. It seems to me beyond doubt that change is needed, especially when the use of technology in schools is conspicuous by its absence or by its superficial or ad hoc use. But the solution is not as simple as flooding schools with technology. After all, technology is already part of the furniture. Instead, it's about improving the pedagogic interaction here between an adult and a child, here in the school. And that could be within a university, it could be within a coaching environment. There are multiple ways. And I turn here to Fletcher, who uses a really nice analogy. Fletcher suggests when you go to a hardware store to buy a drill, you don't actually want a drill, you want a hole. But they don't sell holes at the hardware store. But they do sell drills, which are the technology used to make holes. We cannot lose sight of that technology, for the most part, is a tool, and it should be used in applications which address educational concerns. I think the problem is we've concentrated too hard on the drill, and we've forgotten that actually what we're looking for is a hole in the pedagogic process. Now, if we return to Amundsen and Scott, then I would argue that they had the same hole, but they used different drills. So, what might a pedagogy of technology look like? So I'm going to give you two examples. One is from a more traditional program, and one is from a models-based program. So when Dara Castelli was looking at fit for fitness, she suggested that when moderate to vigorous physical activity is valued, some teachers turn to technology to help them achieve things that they could not achieve alone. And if I want to give you a really good example of this, I'll give you the PE Geek. Now, Jared Robinson is an Australian teacher who's basically come in and is using tools in a way that is quite breathtaking. And if we take that notion of fitness, these are some of the apps that are available, just that he was blogging about and talking about in terms of fitness testing, fitness meters, Army Fitness, Bleep Test. Now these are some of the things we see a lot in traditional programs, and yet he's bringing them onto handheld devices and into classrooms and really looking, not just using them, but how we use them to enhance and stimulate learning through that process. Another example will come from the work of Peter Hasty and I in a sport education season, when we were looking at a way of using technology to develop the process. And we actually did it in games making, and the first 7 weeks was done designing their own games. Now, instead of doing that in a face-to-face basis, well, we did do it face-to-face, but we also employed a wiki. And we chose the wiki because it allowed the students to engage in 24/7 engagement. They suggested do international collaboration, so while my kids in the UK were doing it in their schools, Peter's post-undergraduate students were doing it with their students in high school, and they were also doing it in their PE program. And there was a collaboration in terms of what was happening, and that was instantaneous. It allowed for monitoring and peer interaction, so there was a chat board I could go on, and you could go forward and backwards through iterations, and it facilitated quick feedback in terms of the way we used it. So it was used very much for that process that we couldn't do. We could have done it on paper, but actually, in this case, it was much richer in terms of how we managed to achieve it. And the wiki sets it up itself as allowing summaries and notifications, easy editing, and teamwork and sharing access. And to be blunt, most universities have these systems. You know, they have these ways of doing it, and this study was done 2007, 2008, and in that way it's become much more pervasive in terms of the way that technology is available. So in looking at these as solutions, how do they become pedagogic? What is a pedagogy of technology? So I argue that we must not repeat previous mistakes and use technology just to make things a little easier. Instead, we must take an inclusive approach to technology and use it to enhance learning and teaching. Robertson suggests that we need to disenthrall ourselves from 20th century solutions. And Fulham would suggest that we are too busy creating visions for what was needed for the 20th century, instead of creating and implementing better and more future-orientated education for all kids. Sue MacDonald suggested that the curriculum reform agenda has somewhat ignored what, where and how young people learn and how they engage and act upon digital technologies and the cultures they produce. And I would suggest that in terms of the questions that we're asking around how we use technology are actually the wrong questions. And this is a crude look at, it's kind of, how am I using technology lessons so that the kids think I'm hip, or so that I can tick the box to suggest that I've done technology, rather than actually thinking, what pedagogic gaps exist that technology can help me to bridge? Now, if we return to these examples again, we need to think of better alternatives. Well, alternatives should be used to do things better. So how does the technology allow me to do this better? How does it increase the pedagogic process? And it has to be done with respect. You know, I think one of the reasons that lots of people are reticent is if you try to get Wi-Fi in Missy's office, it doesn't work. So if that's my lecture theatre, how do I overcome that process? And if the Wi-Fi goes down or something, it does become difficult if you're relying on those things. But it is finding alternatives and trying not to be sort of too overwhelmed by those possibilities. Use of technology needs a clear purpose and to be used appropriately. It needs to be included in what we're doing, which means at the planning stage, rather than, oh, I've got this, I can integrate it into this situation, so it becomes an add-on. And technology needs to be used for the betterment of everyone. And one of the increasing problems is access. If you have an iPad in a class of 30, then you don't necessarily have access. If you have one camera, you can't have 30 people working independently on one interactive whiteboard. So you have to work out how actually this process allows them. Does everybody get to use it at the same time? How do you get fair distribution? Now, one of the arguments is increasingly being made is that the microization of technology is making it cheaper and cheaper. And actually, it's becoming less and less of a barrier to get these processes in place. You've got 30 iPads, which is a great way of doing more than just film, but you can get very, very cheap mobile phones down with cameras, and you can do a lot of these processes much better. And another way to do it is what they call BOYD, which is Boyd or Bring Your Own Device. And this is about encouraging people to use their own devices that they already have. Now, interestingly, if I return back to this as I bring this to a close, then Mark Twain said, "I never let my schooling interfere with my education." And I ask if our students are saying, "I never let my schooling interfere with my technological education." This is something that must change. If they are learning these processes, and I'll return to the notion of digital natives that was being talked about this morning. You weren't all there. And there's an assumption that young people do know more about it than us, and actually they just know different things. They're not necessarily any evidence they necessarily know more. They do use them more, but they use them in a very specific way. And I wonder if I will never let my fear or ignorance of technology interfere with the education of my students. So I ask you, should we have a pedagogy of technology for physical education? Can we afford not to? Thank you.